Okay, good morning, everyone. Bonjour. And thank you so much for taking the time to spend a bit of your morning or afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from, with us at the Canadian Urban Institute today for what I know will be a thought-provoking and important conversation ahead. My name is Kate, and I am a part of the team at the Canadian Urban Institute. And I'm just delighted today to be your moderator, filling in for where Mary Rowe usually leads these discussions, but delighted to be a part of the conversation that we have ahead. We always begin with a land acknowledgement, but of course today it feels especially important to stop and reflect on the land that we are privileged to occupy. I know that many of us we've got people calling in from all across the country, the lands of many Indigenous peoples. I am joining you from the territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, Lenni Lenape, and Huron-Wendat peoples. And I know for all of us, it is with sadness and a heavy heart that we reflect on not only the land where we sit, but also the tremendous amount of work that there is to do to address the colonial legacy of Canada, and in particular, the tragedies of the residential schools. So it is in that spirit that we are gathered today. We are here to talk about the broader project of addressing systemic inequality, and in particular, thinking about the gender gap. And we have just a terrific panel here who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. But first, just want to give a bit of context about where this conversation emerged. So I know that many of us have been worried about the gender gap in Canada for a long time. We know that this existed long before the pandemic, but we also know that the pandemic has worsened it significantly. The World Economic Forum reports that the gender gap has grown by a generation over the last year to 136 years, which means that a baby born today will not live in a world with gender parity in their natural life. And I don't know about you, but I find that totally unacceptable. And so a group of partners, including the Canadian Urban Institute, the Pay Equity Office of Ontario, and generously supported by Libro Credit Union and our data partner Advanis, came together and said, let's have some conversations, not only about understanding what the gender gap looks like coming out of COVID, but also what we can do about it. So this conversation is just part of a day of reflection on these questions. We started by releasing a report that I'm hoping we can, a colleague of mine can put into the chat, and I'd encourage you to take a look, and it captures some of the less obvious gendered impacts of what we know about COVID today, including things like people who identify as women have experienced more sleepless nights or feel a greater sense of worry about their family members. They have more anxiety about the world opening up again. It includes some of those less obvious things we've seen over the last year. This conversation that you are here for, we are going to be unpacking this further, and we've got a terrific panel of experts who can speak to both those obvious and less obvious impacts about how the pandemic has widened our gender gap. And then if you wish to join us again at 1 o'clock, we'll continue the conversation, although with different speakers and a different moderator, to talk about solutions. We've got 8 panelists, each of whom are going to present one big idea, a concrete policy solution, including things around reconciliation, transforming the workplace and maternity leave, childcare, and a number of other solutions. So it'll be an important discussion to be here for as well. So without any further ado, we will dive into the discussion. I know that many of you are already active in the chat. I would encourage you to say hello, first of all, let us know where you're calling in from. But if you've got questions and thoughts throughout the discussion, please feel free to be an active part of the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, so today, as I said, we've got just a terrific panel joining us, and panel, maybe it's cheesy, I don't know, maybe you can say hi when I introduce you, but we have Paulette Senior, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. I know many of these faces are certainly not strangers to those of you who have followed City Talks before. Rosemarie Powell, who is the Executive Director of the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Vicki Saunders, who is the founder of SheEO. Petra Kassun-Mutch, who is an entrepreneur, and she's an author, and we are putting the full bio so you can read all about the impressive accomplishments of these women in the chat. And finally, Joanne Vanderheyden, who is the mayor of Strathroy-Caradoc and was recently elected as the president of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So welcome to the panel, and thank you to each of you for being here. Okay, so the first question is kind of the big one, and just as a heads up, maybe we'll start with you, Paulette. but would love to hear from the whole panel. I'd like to hear about what you've observed over the last 15 months about COVID and the gender impact. So we know that our experiences with COVID have been different depending on who you are and where you live. But I'm interested in hearing some of the obvious, but also less obvious things that you've seen that will linger in COVID's wake and that we need to be paying attention to. So let's start with you, Paulette, and then maybe we'll go to you, Vicki.
Thank you so much, Kate. Happy to be here. Happy to be among these incredible women, co-panelists. And I am also joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog, Island First Nation, and Williams Treaty signatories of the Mississauga and Chippewa Nations, aka Pickering. I also am happy to be here because of the fight and struggle and resistance of my ancestors, such that we have survived to this time. So we know that impacts have been uneven, particularly for women, especially those providing essential services and care, and fundamentally so for mothers, particularly those working in front lines and the roles that they occupy in caregiving and health, especially for single moms. We also know that managing all of the burdens related to paid work, taking care of both children and elderly folks and loved ones, as well as staying safe and keeping others safe, has put tremendous strain on women and mothers' mental health and gender diverse folks. And we know the barriers are more complex for mothers and caregivers who are Indigenous, Black, racialized, and newcomers. The circumstances they face have been all the more difficult by policy issues like lack of paid sick days that we've heard in the news quite a bit over the past 6 months or more, and low pay for the vital essential workers who are keeping the rest of us safe. So at the Women's Foundation, we did a survey back in May of this year that found almost 46%, so almost half of the mothers and caregivers surveyed were reaching their breaking point. And all of this is rooted, I think, in the fact that caregiving, both paid and unpaid, has been traditionally considered women's work and therefore undervalued. The devastating consequences we're seeing now are making it crystal clear that we have to fundamentally change our approach to the care economy in Canada. And an additional critical point that I must make is that the necessary social restrictions of the pandemic have increased the risk of violence for those who are living in abusive or unhealthy relationships. What we've heard from the shelters who protect these women is that the conditions have created situations where it's like a pressure cooker in the home with none of the usual safety valves. Even before the pandemic, it was difficult for those living in abusive or unsafe situations to reach out for help. And now the barriers have multiplied. And so back in last year, we actually worked with a PR firm to pro bono to create a tool called the Signal for Help. I don't know if folks have seen that, but it's a signal that's gone global and is being used in different countries around the world. But it really is a tool that can be used in a situation such as this today, where folks are working online and they need to be able to signal for help. And that means finding a safe way to actually reach out and see what kind of help they need. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to share for the opening question. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Paulette. Vicki, and then we'll go to Rosemarie.
Thank you, Paulette. And I'm coming to you today from Treaty 13 in Toronto. Wow, so many things. So I'm going to come at this a little bit from the entrepreneur perspective, which I am founder of an organization and a community called SheEO, about to change our name. Excited about that. And we have this amazing community across 5 countries, but I'll just speak specifically to Canada today, a community of radically generous women who are here working on the world's to-do list, some of the major challenges we're facing. And what I've seen during COVID is permission to create the world you want to live in. This is one of the sort of like, I'm already sort of going to the future around these things, but it was just, it's been so obvious, all the things that aren't working during COVID. So many of the challenges, how, here we are serving the economy versus the economy is supposed to serve us. the reckoning around the care economy. We have entrepreneurs who are actually building the businesses of the future that pay attention to a lot of these barriers in our systems. And so what I'm going to come at this from what this is enabling is you're an entrepreneur. Everything in this world is made up. We can change it. If it's untenable for you to be running your business at this time with all the things that are going on during COVID, caring for elders, caring for children, et cetera, change it. Make up your own rules. Who has to work 8 hours a day? It's not a thing. Like, it's a made up thing, right? And so I'm talking about this totally from a privileged perspective of those entrepreneurs, but also from this community that's sharing its resources. One of the things that we've seen is we have taken the resources, and by that I mean the financial resources, but also our influence and our power and our expertise and our skills, and put those towards the highest and best use of what our community needs. So we do a regular red, yellow, green. Who's in trouble? Who needs help? How can we help? And we've built this muscle of asking for support from one another. The virtual world has made it easier to be able to connect with people, say things out loud, I need help. And for those who do have extra time and supports, to step in and help those folks. And so in our community, none of our ventures went down this year. Every one of them pivoted, found the support they needed, got some bridge loans, got the support, whatever it was, in order to continue with their work of building the new world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that lately, but the real opportunity that I saw come out of this, or that we're in at the moment, is this chance to really decolonize ourselves and to really interrogate the rules that we think we have in society for how we need to operate, and change them to work better for us as humans instead of just constantly serving the economy.
Okay. It's probably one of the most positive reflections on COVID that I've ever heard. Thank you very much, Vicki. Rosemarie, and then we'll go to you, Petra.
Thank you very much. We all know the expression last in, first out. And this has been the case for underrepresented groups in the workplace for a very long time. And what we are also seeing is that the construction industry, which is the area in which we are really trying to make a deep impact, is that it's a similar kind of situation that is happening. And so we're looking at the jobs and economic opportunities that women ought to be able to access, and industries that are consistently leaving them out. So our goal is to see people who have been traditionally left out of the planning and decision-making process get a say in shaping their communities and their future. And too often we see that Black and Indigenous and racialized peoples are the ones to bear the brunt of the burden when planning and development decisions are being made. And we know this impacts on women from these communities, women in general, and just people who do not conform to gender norms. They have an even more profound experience within the planning and development process. We saw this happening before the pandemic, so this is not new, but we see it exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we use the community benefits process as a way to help change this paradigm. When we're thinking about the planning and development in the construction industry, it's a process and a system and an industry that has really been built on the foundation of patriarchy historically. And our work here at the Toronto Community Benefits Network, and just why I'm so engaged and passionate about all of this, is that we want women to know that regardless of their background, they can carve out a pathway in this industry and benefit from the economic prosperity that comes out of the investments that we see our governments making every day in infrastructure. As we look to get out of this, to recover from COVID, government is investing billions of dollars. The government of Canada has a $187 billion plan for investment in infrastructure. How do we ensure that as these infrastructure across our country are being built, that people who's been underrepresented in the industry, and especially women, get an opportunity to be able to participate in building up their country, building up their neighborhoods. And so we ask through community benefits for for the industry to make commitments to equity hiring when building infrastructure. And the reason that we focus on the planning and development industry, is definitely we're applying economic lens, but it's important because this is our taxpayer dollars that we're using. Construction industry accounts for more than 14% of Canada's GDP. And it's an industry that supports over 260,000 businesses. Yet it's an industry that women, have not been able to fully tap into, much less Black and Brown women. And the report from the Ontario Construction Secretariat in Ontario shows that only 2% of women are able to participate in the construction industry. And the challenge that we're seeing is that even with this, 2% that is participating, even when they're on the job, they have a really challenging time just being able to survive and to thrive. Some of them don't continue because of the systemic, gender issues and barriers that they experience on the job. And so our work is to look at how do we ensure that through the community benefits agreement, negotiations process, we carve out a space for women so they can participate in the economy, so that they can participate in building their communities. This is when we think especially about construction, it's a job that we're not socialized to think that we can do. Women are socialized, from very young, even by our own families and our own parents, that it's not an industry, that we want to even consider a career in, right? We're thinking about it's a tough industry. These are oftentimes some of the first responders, but women are tough. Women are the caretakers in our communities. When we think about Black and racialized women, oftentimes, they're the mothers and the caretakers in their communities, and they deserve to have opportunities that will allow them to be able to provide for their families and to be able to build up their communities. And so, looking forward to talk a little bit more about that and to really think about how within the construction industry and the planning and development sector, we can have a stronger voice for women in the decision and planning process.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rosemarie. Petra, what have you observed over the last 15 months about gender and COVID and how the gender gap may be widening?
Okay, great, thanks. And I'm so delighted to be here as well and see so many people I've met in the past. So apart from being a media entrepreneur, so I am an entrepreneur, but I exist in the grassroots micro entrepreneur space. So that's where most of my perspective comes from. I see the women's entrepreneurship space as a kind of like a layered cake, and most of the attention is on the icing and everybody forgets about the fruits and nuts and the layers below. And that's where I work. I teach entrepreneurship at Elizabeth Fry. I teach entrepreneurship to youth with mostly women with mental health challenges, and work a lot in the grassroots women's entrepreneurship support spaces, for example, with the Immigrant Women in Business, which has 500 members, started by Svetlana Radnikova, but has never received any government funding, is not really an official institution, but does a lot for women entrepreneurs who are newcomers to Canada, and she's based here in Toronto. So that's where I work, at the bottom of the layer cake. So my perspective is informed from that. I would say that what's less obvious about the COVID she-recovery conversation is that women entrepreneurs are left out. In fact, even in this pandemic report, which was a precursor to this panel, there's no mention of women entrepreneurs, and they're different than wage earning sisters. So in the economy, we have 8.4 million women in the economy. Only 15% of them are entrepreneurs. Of those 15%, which is about 1 million self-employed women and another 118,000 businesses, the vast majority are companies of one. And a little further up the chain of, about over 70, 80% are companies with less than 4 people or pay contractors that are equivalent to hiring 1 to 4 people. Most of them only make, on average, $68,000 a year gross, which is about the same as a social worker and a registered nurse. It's about $34 an hour. And at the same time, there's like this narrative that women entrepreneurs, and I like to think about it this way. The left thinks women entrepreneurs are mini male capitalists, and the right think women entrepreneurs are mini male capitalists, and both are wrong. In fact, I would argue that women entrepreneurs and their sisters in the nonprofit sector who found nonprofits that are also small, similar statistics on both sides, need to be seen as a whole thing. Because most women entrepreneurs, as Vicki pointed out, are actually trying to change the system, change business culture, change the way we do business, because most become entrepreneurs out of necessity, at least at the grassroots level, or they've had trauma in the mainstream, waged environment in some way. They class ceiling is one, but sexual harassment, all kinds of stories that I hear that are the reason women become entrepreneurs for the most part. So with that in mind, I want to just say that we have kind of overlooked the women entrepreneurs, the grassroots level in the SheRecovery. And some studies have been done. So the pandemic study, one by Fifth Wave, also shows that stress and mental health were big issues for women entrepreneurs, especially at the grassroots level, because they generate revenue to pay their bills, not to create wealth for shareholders. And business interruption when you're a woman entrepreneur means no access to EI. You don't have the same access to some of the support system because you're not kind of part, you can't sort of, often you don't pay yourself in that way. So a lot of them fell through the cracks, even though there were some great benefits. CEBA, for example, the Canadian Emergency Business Benefit did not work for a lot of women entrepreneurs. It was changed and it was a little bit better, but still 880,000 businesses received access to the CEBA Emergency Business Benefit. But no one has done a gender lens analysis on that to see whether or not, how many women entrepreneurs actually received that funding. And I guess I would also say that the additional stresses around for women entrepreneurs that are the same as their wage sisters are the fact that there is no safety net. They can lose their businesses that they've been trying to work on for a long time, lose traction. And I'll just say one last thing, another little known aspect is that bankruptcy laws in Canada and the way we do bankruptcy here, different than the United States and so on, actually affects women more because we are, women entrepreneurs are more likely to be undercapitalized. We squeeze by a thread, not by a margin this big. And so we're like really precarious in terms of making a dollar to pay our bills. And that's misunderstood as well. And most of them use their own money or provide personal guarantees for businesses that they start, a service business, whatever it is. And they're more likely to have to declare bankruptcy, or if they're going for a consumer proposal, anyone who's been through that knows that it basically knocks you out of being eligible for any entrepreneurship support for the next 7 years. So we actually, once a woman has to go, that a women entrepreneur goes under, she is less likely to go back and be an entrepreneur and leverage her learning from the first round than, let's say, women entrepreneurs in other jurisdictions. So I feel, just to sum that up, women entrepreneurs are a unique, different facet of the women in the economy world, and it's really misunderstood. And I feel like we need to redraw the lines and include more of women entrepreneurship specific concerns in any pandemic SheRecovery work that we do.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much, Petra. Mayor Vanderheyden, sorry, Your Worship, I don't know how to refer to you now. President Vanderheyden.
Joanne works.
You've got a unique vantage point of looking at communities all across the country. FCM has been tremendously active over the past year. Tell us a bit about what you've observed.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to join me. I want to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 21 territory, and I'm totally thankful to the generations of people who have taken care of this land before we got here. I come to you with the perspective of an elected official. I also come to you as a woman engaged in supporting other women. And as FCM president, we represent a membership of over 2,000 municipalities coast to coast to coast. So that's a little bit about where we come from, where I come from. And I can tell you that the gender, racial, and economic disparities are being amplified by the pandemic. And the most profound impacts are absolutely being felt by those facing multiple forms of disadvantage. Women are the most vulnerable to the social and economic repercussions of the pandemic. Women are bearing the brunt of the negative effects. Even before COVID-19, women were doing 3 times as much unpaid work as men. Since the pandemic began, demands for care work have intensified with children out of school, sick family members, and overwhelmed health services. And in here, I'm going to give you an example that I heard more than once from members of our community, that even access to respite for caregivers has been absolutely non-existent because everything closed. Access to medication has been next to impossible. This is something that they need for life-giving. And the price just went through the roof for all of that. PPEs. You know, we just talked about PPE now because we need it. But there have been people that have been caregivers with high medical needs, care that they've had to provide, and they can't even get the PPEs for the things that they do day to day. So, you know, those are just sidebars of things that are affecting people that we don't even think about, because unless it affects you, you don't think about it. So this is where it's really important for us to talk to other women and have events like this where we can find out where are the gaps and how can we solve them. So I think this is awesome that you're having this discussion. Women tend to earn and save less as they often occupy part-time jobs or jobs in the informal sector, which also implies limited or no access to health benefits and sick leaves and other social protections. Women also form the majority of single-parent households. And to this point, globally, women are the majority of older persons, and older women tend to face lower life incomes and lower pensions, because women contribute a great deal of their time to unpaid and low-paid care work. They're also then not building up funds in our pension plans like Canada Pension. So it's cyclical, and we have to figure out a way to change that. Mm-hmm. The necessity of providing comprehensive local public services must not be ignored and must be valued as we establish a framework for the recovery. Women's jobs are disproportionately affected as they take on greater demands at home. School closures have disproportionately affected education outcomes of adolescent girls who take on more chores and care work burdens at home. And this even is amplified in the rural areas where you have less access to services, isolation, and broadband is horrible. So, you know, we're going backwards instead of forwards. We need to take care of this. We really need to make sure that we have policies in place and procedures in place that we can hear people and find out what we can do moving forward. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is all of my conversations with women across Canada, across our county, across our region, they're exhausted. Their mental well-being is just being, they don't even know what to do anymore. So again, there's so many needs out there, and COVID has just exemplified them to the nines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you've given us I think, robust picture of how the pandemic has had gendered impacts, but also how it's addressed or how it's deepened other inequalities. We've talked about entrepreneurs, talked about women in the construction industry. We've talked about communities, frontline workers. I'm wondering if we can switch gears now and talk about what priorities you think decision makers should be focused on in the pandemic's wake. So I think there's this sense that we're almost through this. People are so excited for it to be done. But of course, a lot has happened, right? People are coming through this year after being isolated, after going through disruption. It's also been a year where there's been horrific tragedies. I'm from London. We had a horrible act of Islamophobia and terror within the last few weeks. There have been awful acts of anti-Black racism. And of course, as we spoke about, we continue to just be deeply saddened about the history of the residential schools. So a lot has happened and people are coming through this in a very difficult place. It sometimes feels like there's just too much to focus on. So if you were to give some advice to decision makers, what should be the priority as we are thinking about addressing inequalities as we come out of COVID? And Rosemarie, maybe we'll start with you. I think you've done the heroic task of switching technology mid-panel. It's everybody's nightmare to have their internet go down. Congratulations on doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you heard the question, let's start with you, and then maybe we'll go to Vicki. We'll move in a different order.
Yeah, what we would like to see, what I'd like to see is an inclusive recovery. And this was our focus in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic when, we recognized that the government was planning on spending money on infrastructure, our taxpayer dollars, to recover from COVID. And they were looking for shovel-ready projects. And what we wanted to do is to make sure that the government is thinking about how can those funds be used in a way that could also have multiple benefits. We're not asking, how can we make sure that the talents within our local communities are being considered? And so we want to see policy within the procurement process that ensures that, community benefits agreements are going to be required. We did a Canada-wide campaign, and we got over 1,000 organizations and people, supporting our concept for a community benefits agreement. And we did a lot of, advocacy at all levels of government with our elected representatives. And just recently, the government did confirm on the transit projects, the Ontario line and the Eglinton Crosstown extension to the east and to the west, that their $12 billion contribution must have a community benefits agreement. And for the community, this is an incredible win. Because what this means is that people who have been not having an opportunity on these projects are now able to do so. We see that community benefits work. We have a 10% commitment, for example, on the Eglinton Crosstown project, and over 400 people have gotten a job on the project. Many of them lost their opportunity during the pandemic, unfortunately, but construction was retained as an essential service. And so it means that these are good opportunities, and people, need to have the chance to be able to participate in building up their own communities. And community benefits agreements in policy is absolutely the way to go.
That is a very big idea. Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. If this was in a room, this is the part where we'd all be standing up and cheering for that idea. Wonderful. Okay, Vicki, and then we'll go to Paulette.
Yeah, totally agreeing to all of that. Community, everything. Okay, so many thoughts. First of all, just stop. We have such a moment. I feel like we're between worlds. We know what happens in the past. We know what our systems and our structures have. They've laid bare all of these inequities. People are using systems in sentences. That did not happen before COVID, right? Systemic barriers. I mean, people on this panel, yes. But in general, I can't believe how many people are schooled now about barriers that exist out there. How many people are really starting to recognize the challenges that we're facing and how it's rooted in our systems. So if our systems don't change, we're not going to change the outcomes. So this is a really big issue. And I think we have a moment in time right now. We have basically 0% interest rates globally. There is more than enough money out there at really good rates, 0%, to rethink what we're doing in the world. And I think this is just a huge, huge moment to not just barrel ahead with the same thinking we've had in the past, but to actually rethink. If there was more than enough money in front of you to create whatever kind of world would you want, do we really just want to create level the playing field for women? I think most of the systems that we have out there need to be rethought. And so you have to decolonize yourself in order to do that. So the future to me does not look very much like the past. Where I'm seeing every day these phenomenal new designs. We have a home healthcare company as just an example so people can understand, who wants to provide home healthcare at cost. Imagine something like this. And she's created a platform. She has 15,000 healthcare workers on this platform. And this is an example of what's possible in this realm of rethinking healthcare. A woman with a spinal cord injury who lives on Indigenous reserve. A few weeks ago at 9 a.m., a care worker reaches out and said, we have to get help to her. Reaches out to Jenny. This is the company is called Got Care. By 12 o'clock, they had a home care worker in her house 3 hours later who was Indigenous, who lived around the corner from her on reserve. I mean, and this is like a matching system for people to provide that care, values aligned, close to you, and with a small margin on top of that to redo healthcare. She's also working with insurance companies to solve all the problems they can't figure out. A radical rethinking of what healthcare looks like, a radical rethinking of what work can look like, platforms where people are like, I can work 6 hours a week. I'm highly talented in this sector is where I want to, and a marketplace for people to be able to enter the workplace on their own terms that fits with their life circumstances at the moment. Rethinking what works look like versus let's just pile billions of dollars into childcare, which we need to have. And we also need to rethink work because the ways we've evolved is not healthy for any of us. And it creates so much stress and it's insane. So for me, there's so much rethinking of what we've got in front of us. We have this moment in time to not go back to the past and just try and like improve the pay gap 136 years or whatever craziness it is right now. And rethink that. So for me, I want to see a percentage of funds throwing spaghetti at the wall to try and create the new world. It puts some money into experiments that are actually getting some traction out there to rethink things. We have everything that we need. It just needs to be distributed differently.
Okay, well, Vicki, you're getting lots of nods, and Laurel in the chat says she also votes for a new system. So you're seeing lots of agreement that is needed right now. Paulette, and then we'll go to Joanne and then Petra.
I'm just sitting here so excited because this is such a vital conversation, and it is, as Vicki says, such a moment in time that we can't allow to slip by, right? And so the Canadian Women's Foundation, we raise funds, but we are a grant-making organization to bring about gender equality. That is our mission. And in doing that work, we have the opportunity to actually understand what's going on in communities from coast to coast to coast, because we fund over 2,500 organizations to provide grants. So, you know, we have tuned into these organizations to hear what they're saying. And, you know, other than the fact that we know that, you know, gender-based violence or women who are entrepreneurs or homelessness, poverty, we know these issues have deepened, but here is the opportunity to actually make different decisions to create a different world. Because as Vicki says, normal wasn't good for everybody. Right? So the opportunity to actually create something different, I think, is monumental. And if there's anything good about a pandemic, it's that it's given us the opportunity to sit, to pause, to think. There's also the fact that I think that with everything that you mentioned, that Kate, around, you know, that's happening, that we're seeing now, that we have time to see, from George Floyd to missing and murdered, to you know, anti-Asian racism, everything that we've been seeing, we now can't unsee, you know? And so the opportunity that we have to do something about it by prioritizing our decision-making on what's not working, I think is incredible. So it's really about making sure that our hard-earned dollars are going towards these areas. So that could be making sure that organizations, for example, that are providing essential, life-saving, community-building care and support around the country are not funded as if they're projects, but they're getting the kind of funding that allows them for years in the future to be able to plan and develop and work with community to build community and to address those who are the hardest impacted, not just by the pandemic, but even before the pandemic. So because we think that those who are experiencing the deepest problems actually have the solutions themselves. One of the things I'd like to see as a decision is that we can actually as a foundation that is only allowed to fund charities, we want to be able to fund nonprofits, because nonprofits that don't have charitable numbers are also doing great work in communities across Canada. So for example, not being able to fund non-charities creates a problem, because it's usually organizations or communities that are suffering the most who create nonprofits in order to respond to urgent and emerging needs in their communities. So not being able to fund them means that we're missing a whole bunch of good work that could be done in the community, or else we'll continue to see what we've been seeing. So, you know, this is important. We're also funding social entrepreneurs and supporting women to develop their businesses, because as Petra spoke about earlier, you know, this melding of the nonprofit and business for profit is exactly what women's lives look like in reality, right? So it is women primarily who are creating the nonprofits to be able to respond to the social problems in their community. And some of them have made a business out of it, and some of them have created charities or nonprofits to do that. So we have to see it as a whole and be able to respond as a whole. And that's what we would like to do as a Canadian Women's Foundation. So the piecemeal approach is no longer okay. It was never okay. And so we have the opportunity to strengthen the women's sector and the ability to serve diverse and communities, and to do that with not just with a gender lens, but with an intersectional gender lens.
Powerfully said. Thank you very much, Paulette. Joanne, what do you see as being the biggest priorities coming out of this?
Oh, so many thoughts as well. I'm going to talk about this from a public servant perspective. We as public servants are looking to make livable communities safe for all. That's really what we do. We do that every single day. So local governments around the world have really worked flat out to keep people safe, turning arenas into shelters for vulnerable residents, deferring property taxes, keeping vital services running strong for citizens. These all had to happen. Local governments have done this in the face of an unprecedented municipal financial crisis. Plummeting revenues, rising costs, no ability to run deficits. It quickly became clear in our conversations with local governments that municipalities were facing a real financial crisis that put Canadians' health and our economic recovery at risk. It does come down, some of it, to money, because we need that in order to put everything in place here at this local level. So for example, we saw that the pandemic was making the housing crisis worse, and that's in big cities, small cities, but in cities like Edmonton and Vancouver, Canadians without a home of their own are struggling to find safe shelter in the era of physical distancing. We also really saw early on that the pandemic presented unique challenges for rural communities and their municipal operations. Agricultural workers, limitations of broadband, access to healthcare, educational remote work, and I spoke to that earlier. FCM has been working hard to integrate a rural lens into our COVID-19 response. The pandemic has also shown how vulnerable we can all be as individuals, as communities, and as a country. Going back to the status quo will not be enough. Going back to the status quo will simply not be enough. At its core, that means building a more inclusive Canada, where every Canadian and every community can take part in the future that we build. And any discussion around inclusive recovery has to include a discussion on how this country can confront systemic racism. That is a conversation that FCM and municipal leaders are having. In cities and towns around the world, local governments are trying to understand and address the needs of their citizens in this time of crisis. As more data on the different impacts of the crisis emerge, municipal governments are well placed to apply a gender lens to their response. Recovery planning and decision-making. We need to be at the table. As the level of government closest to its citizens, local governments also have to have an imperative to do so to adequately serve residents, especially the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you. And Petra, last but not least, what do you see as the priorities coming through this? Oh, and you're on mute. It looked like a good start. There we go.
I'm all excited because I just loved what everybody was talking about. So yes, 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 yes. And so I want to say to Paulette, love the idea of, let's get rid of this tax category thinking about who's an entrepreneur and who's not. It's women doing things outside of the mainstream economic system, starting their own enterprises, whether they're co-ops or collectives or whatever. So that's one thing. I would love to see a grant-making organization for women entrepreneurs. We have lots of loan-making organizations, but frankly, we don't all need more loans. We have enough debt. So there's that, and figuring that out. When Joanne was saying, that we are starting to have conversations, deep conversations about confronting racism everywhere, which is great. But, it wasn't that long ago that saying racism at a board table was a bad thing. And I feel like we have to start confronting toxic capitalism. I'm a businesswoman, but I think we can do something other than what we're doing now, kind of what Vicki was saying. And we need to foster those conversations. We need to encourage them. And so my couple of policy ideas around this, I would love to see Canada create a network of gendered innovation centers. Other countries have them. There are some in the States and Europe. We don't. And as a feminist government, why don't we have gendered innovation centers, incubators, and accelerators that actually would fund process innovations like Vicki's talking about, people who are doing business differently outside of the venture capital mainstream sort of way that you build a business kind of conversation. I think that would be super cool. I also think it would be great as an innovation, I feel like you can't get equality in a sustainable way or equity without confronting capitalism in a serious way. And one of the ways I would suggest that is I would love to see something called a citizen dividend out there, which is different than UBI. I kind of think of it as taking the outsized profits that offshore corporations and other big corporations make in Canada, because we all create a stable business environment to make that possible, redistributed to Canadians, just like we did with the COVID-19 benefits. Boom, there you go. Once a year, you get a share of the profits made by the top 100 corporations in Canada. And that way, because it's possible because of who we are, the culture, and the environment we keep. And then finally, I guess those would be the main ideas. Grant-making organization for women entrepreneurs, especially now, to help them to continue to be able to keep going, because it takes 3 to 5 years to even build something that can support you and help you pay your bills. Gendered innovation centers, and this idea of a citizen dividend, because unless we confront capitalism, we are never going to have lasting equity anywhere.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Thanks to all of you. So if I'm hearing you, we have a good sense that this has been a very tough experience. There have been highly gendered, racialized. We know that people who are facing barriers have had a tougher year, but I also hear a lot of hope and optimism that this is a moment where transformative change is unusually possible, and you've given us lots of examples of what that can look like. We're into our last 10 minutes here. I'm wondering if we could just go around the room, go around the table once more, and you could share for one closing thought with us about what Build Back Better looks like. I don't know about you, maybe it's just because I had a baby during a pandemic. I love this idea of being a transformative moment, but I'm just so damn tired. So maybe you could speak to, if this is a moment where change is possible, what does Build Back Better look like for you, and what can we do to get there? So let's go in a different order this time. Let's start with Joanne, and then we'll go to Petra.
That's a tall order, coming up with just a few sentences. Thank you.
Well, it can be more than a few if you like.
Specifically, we need to reduce the gender gap and create a more inclusive recovery. As communities move forward, we need to uphold and fund services to reduce gender-based violence. We need to coordinate our police efforts, our social service efforts, our health units. And we need to become a partnership and a team, not pockets of help. We need to do this all so we all work together with the best interests of everyone in mind. We need to ensure that women's voices and interests are reflected in decision-making around the pandemic and around every board table, be it political, be it business. We need to be there, because otherwise we can't put our thoughts on the table, and the gender piece will never come to fruition. We also need to collect and analyze data disaggregated by gender, age, race, and other vulnerability factors to underpin the policies and service design and budget decisions, because they all come hand in hand. And how are we going to get to the end line if we don't know where we're starting? So we need to have that in place. And of course, we need to review budgets and services with gender and inclusion lens, because again, we can't just do it the way we've always been doing it. We need to move forward, and we can do it. I know we can.
Okay, great. Petra, and then Rosemarie.
Yeah, I guess what I'd like to see next out of this, I'm going to get really from these ideas to really practical stuff. I really do think we need to, in the next year, have a strategy for getting more money into the hands of women entrepreneurs who are at risk of closing their ventures, ventures that serve communities, that are important to communities. That kind of thing. I would like to see more women entrepreneurs added to the Women in the Economy Task Force, which is going to be leading the conversation around, you know, how we come out of the pandemic, because we need more voices and really specific voices at the table, the ordinary women entrepreneurs. And I think just in general, we should be really pressing the government on kind of expanding. We've spent a lot, the West Fund is awesome and has done so much for the ecosystem, but it kind of stays within the boundaries of how we think about entrepreneurship. And I think this is an ideal opportunity for us to reframe entrepreneurship, next generation entrepreneurship, and what that looks like. And that's what Build Back Better means to me, an opportunity to reframe that and give women permission to invent the new systems that Vicki and others here were talking about. Let's not build back better, let's build back feminist. That's sort of and we know that feminist means it's better for everyone.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Rosemarie, and then we'll go to Vicki.
Thank you. What I want to see is community voice at the table, very, very clear. And I want to share an inspirational story as to why this is important. So pre-pandemic, a community like Jane and Finch, where we saw our Black youth just being, you know, killed on the streets. And one woman who lost her son basically, you know, campaigned for quite some time to basically build a community hub and recreation center within that Jane Finch community. She noticed the opportunity that the Finch West LRT was being built and there was land space that was available. And what she did is she connected with the community, she connected with the Toronto and Community Benefits Network. And during the process for negotiating the community benefits agreement with Metrolinx, she presented her powerful story to Metrolinx and to the bidders on that project, and they were inspired. And they agreed that they would set back land for the community to build this community hub and recreation center. If she wasn't there, if her story wasn't centered, this kind of opportunity wouldn't have happened. Now, unfortunately, during the pandemic, we also heard from Metrolinx that they planned on reneging on their commitment to giving the community land to the people. And you know what? The community mobilized, and using the community benefits process, they were able to connect with Metrolinx and the decision makers, with the government, the provincial government and the municipal government, to really kind of push back and to make sure that their needs and their voices were centered in this process. And they won. The community won. Metrolinx is giving that land back to the community through the city. The city is transferring it to the community, and they will build their land. And so what we will see is a restorative kind of, you know, justice that is happening as a result of community being centered, of the women who have been building those communities centered in the decision-making, in the planning and decision-making process, a system that has historically not included the voice of, you know, Black and Indigenous and racialized people and women.
Wow, powerful story. Thank you so much for sharing. Makes the point perfectly. Wow. Vicki, and then we will close with Paulette.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. Community and just to underline one more time, we need to redefine what we value in the world. We are living in a world that centers money, 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 greed, win at all costs. Every business model we have, every structure we have for funding creates more inequality. Those who have get more every single year. We saw that during COVID, and those who don't get farther and farther from actually having a sustainable life. 400 years ago, we chose Adam Smith when we were at a fork in the road and said self-interest is the way to go. That has run its course. It needs to go to palliative care. Thank you very much for all you've done. What do we value going forward? If we don't actually redefine what really matters to us as humans, we will be having this conversation over and over until we're extinct.
Okay. What a compelling note to wrap up on. Thank you very much, Vicki. And Paulette, what does Build Back Better mean for you?
So Rosemarie Brown was one of the 8 fierce feminists who founded the Canadian Women's Foundation, the late, great Rosemarie Brown, the first Black woman to be elected provincial parliament. And she once said, until all of us have made it, none of us have made it. And that is something that I think is important. It's about intersectionality. It's about leaving no one behind. And when we think about some of the things that were announced in the budget, that, by the way, didn't come because of the goodness of any sort of political will. It came because women and advocates pushed for a national childcare program, to end homelessness, for a national housing program, to end gender-based violence. This has been work that's been going on for decades by lots of folks that have gone unnoticed, right? But we're at the precipice now where it cannot be denied. So, and even though the promises have been made, we have to make sure they happen. It's up to us to make sure they happen, whether it's about working with the provinces, whether it's about continuing to push at the municipal or federal levels. We have to make sure it's on. A national childcare program has been decades in the making. And we know that women's lives cannot truly be free to pursue their dreams and their potential without having childcare in this country. We need to end gender-based violence. So there's a national action plan that's being developed to end gender-based violence. I happen to sit on that advisory committee. We're working towards that. These are promises that have not yet been fulfilled. And so it is up to us. This is the time when advocacy is a good word, right? There's no limitation on advocacy. You just have to report that you're advocating, right? But it's good to advocate as charities, as nonprofits. This is what we have to push for. So let's do that together, because until all of us have made it, none of us will make it.
Beautiful. A perfect, yes, a perfect note to wrap up. Thank you very much, Paulette, and thank you to each of you. I'm so grateful to all of you for the work that you're doing. Even before the pandemic, it has been a tough year, and making time to be here with us today, we're just so very grateful. I hope we can continue the discussion. For those of you who are interested, join us at 1 o'clock Eastern, where the conversation will continue. Different moderator, different panelists. It is a packed panel with 8 speakers, like almost unwieldy big as a panel, and each speaker is coming with one specific concrete idea to address the gender gap and some of the other inequities that we have heard from today. I also want to thank our sponsors. Libro Credit Union has made this event possible. It's one of the reasons we can provide these discussions for free. We post the chat, we post the video, we post the transcripts online, and we find that many more people participate at a time that works for them long after the event, and that's all possible because of Libro's support. I want to thank the Pay Equity Commission for leading this work, and the commissioner will be one of the speakers talking about pay equity at our panel at 1 o'clock. And so thank you to the panel once again, and to each of you for making time to be here. We really appreciate it. Please keep the discussion going, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock. Oh, and I forgot, sorry. We also have a poll. We would like to know what you thought about this event. So if you could take just 2 minutes before you depart. Thank you, Jamie. I see that I'm getting text messages reminding me to do this, and I always forget details like that at the end. So please take a moment to do that before we wrap up. But once again, once you're done with that, thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to each of you for being here today, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock to continue the conversation. Take good care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.